The armed forces of Ukraine have launched a large-scale offensive in the south of the country, particularly at the junction of the Zaporizhzhia and Dnipropetrovsk regions. The Ukrainian armed forces are actively using armored vehicles and advancing rapidly. Russian military correspondents were the first to spread this kind of information. But is this really the case? And there have been a lot of differing interpretations about this. On one hand, there is evidence of individual counterattacks by the armed forces of Ukraine. For example, the observer from the information resistance group Konstantin Mashevets directly stated today, and I quote, "In a number of areas in the southern operational zone, the armed forces of Ukraine counterattack the enemy's forward positions, and there are certain results." At the same time, the official representative of the defense forces of southern Ukraine, Vladislav Voloshin, on the contrary, denied this information and stated that there is actually no major counteroffensive, and the Russians are spreading such fake news and not without reason. At the same time, the Washington Institute for the Study of War states that the Russians are falsely claiming a Ukrainian offensive in order to justify redeploying their troops and to make it seem as if they are actually in favor of negotiations, but are forced to defend themselves from the Ukrainian armed forces. The Institute for the Study of War notes that, in fact, it is the Russians who are now actively preparing for a major offensive as soon as mid-spring. So what is really happening? Let's take a look together and figure it out. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to the channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel, Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video. There we post breaking news as it comes in. So, in the last 2 days, February 9 and 10, the Russians have started actively promoting the narrative that the armed forces of Ukraine in the south of our country have launched a large-scale offensive. At the same time, Konstantin Mashevets, an observer from the information resistance group, whom many people refer to, he really is an authoritative military expert. On February 10, the observer reported that in a number of areas in the southern operational zone, the armed forces of Ukraine counterattack the enemy's forward positions. There are certain results. At the same time, the Deep State channel, in its latest map update, reported enemy advances, but analysts have no information about advances by the armed forces of Ukraine. And here the Washington Institute for the Study of War explains what is happening. First, I'll give a large quote, then we'll analyze it. Russian forces are likely falsely claiming that Ukrainian troops are conducting a counteroffensive near the administrative border of Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions in order to refute earlier false reports about the alleged enemy. There are connections in the area. A Russian military blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces are using foggy weather and the recent blocking of Russian troops' use of Starlink terminals in Ukraine to conduct a counteroffensive. Near Sosnovka, Novoalexandrovka, and Nechaevka, north of Gulyapol, another military blogger claimed that Ukrainian forces advanced into Ternuvatoe, northwest of Gulyapol. A Kremlin-linked Russian military correspondent also claimed that Ukrainian forces have launched a local counteroffensive in the eastern part of the Zaporizhzhia region for the first time in a long while. Other military correspondents also claim that Ukrainian forces are conducting a counteroffensive, including with the use of armored vehicles north of Gulyapol, in conditions of fog and reduced Russian communications. Military correspondents of the Russian Federation claim that Ukrainian forces pushed Russian troops out of a position west of Priluki and in Pridorozhnoye, northwest of Gulyapol. Well, at this stage, we note that all the settlements listed have already been declared captured by the Russians, but it turned out that this was not exactly the case and they had to come up with some kind of explanation. So, according to the Institute for the Study of War, the Russians came up with a new large-scale counteroffensive by the Ukrainian armed forces, which supposedly pushed the Russians out of the settlements where they had allegedly already raised the Russian flag. The spokesperson for the Ukrainian Defense Forces in the south, Colonel Vladislav Voloshin, reported that Ukrainian forces maintain control over Ternuvatoe after Russian troops unsuccessfully tried to hold a flag-raising ceremony in the settlement to supposedly provide evidence of its capture. And by the way, the Russians have supposedly captured a great many settlements like this, but in reality, they have not. Voloshin stated this. The front line is currently at least 15 kilometers away from Ternuvata, which the Russians supposedly captured. Voloshin, however, refuted the statement by Russian military correspondents about an alleged Ukrainian counteroffensive on the border of the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia regions. He reported that Ukrainian forces in this area are conducting reconnaissance and search operations to identify Russian infiltration and sabotage groups. But he noted that these actions by Ukraine do not constitute a counteroffensive. Well, as the military calls it, this is a clearing operation against Russian infiltration into populated areas. Voloshin also noted that Russian forces are exaggerating their successes in this area and suggested that now they are trying to use statements about a Ukrainian counteroffensive to spread their lies. The Institute for the Study of War notes numerous complaints from Russian military correspondents themselves about the systematic practice of Russian commanders sending false reports to their superiors about supposedly achieved successes at the front. Russian troops, and accordingly some Russian military correspondents, have likely greatly exaggerated Russia's recent successes in the directions of Alexandrovka and Gulyai-Pol. And now they are trying to use the Ukrainian counteroffensive as a pretext for pulling Russian troops back to certain positions that, well, in reality they already occupy, so there is actually no withdrawal. On paper, they'll claim the Ukrainians launched a counteroffensive, forcing them to retreat from positions they falsely said they captured, but in reality, it's the opposite. The Institute for the Study of War also states that the Russian military command is now planning to launch a new major offensive in the south and east of Ukraine in the summer of 2026 using limited strategic reserves for this purpose. Preparatory activities have already begun, and the campaign itself may start at the end of April. The main directions for a possible strike, according to the Institute for the Study of War, are the Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, and Orekhiv directions toward Zaporizhzhia. However, as analysts note, Russian forces are experiencing serious difficulties in capturing the initial positions necessary to begin that large-scale offensive and have become stuck at the stage of carrying out tactical tasks. Accordingly, all of this casts doubt on the possibility of success for the Russian summer offensive campaign. And so, according to the Institute for the Study of War, since July 2025, Russia has indeed been forming strategic reserves using new conscripts. But it is already facing problems replenishing its losses and has been forced to use those very operational reserves for current battles. The command faces a very difficult choice: to use the limited strategic reserves now to improve their positions, or to save them for the main summer operation, risking not having enough time to create proper conditions for its start. And according to the Institute for the Study of War, the reserves are probably not enough either for proper preparation or for achieving the objectives of the offensive. So, as they say, trust only reliable sources, trust those war correspondents whom you already trust and who have proven themselves, and of course, trust the Ukrainian General Staff. Because the Russians, in case you forgot, have already captured Kupiansk, and after Kupiansk they captured Kupiansk-Uzlovoy, but in reality they're not there at all. I'll leave it at that. Share your thoughts and conclusions in this episode's comments. If you found this episode interesting and useful, you can support our YouTube channel with your donation or by subscribing. All the links and details are in the description of this video. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.